Thank you, Gerald, and thank you, Yechiel, and Ahuva, and everyone else. Thank you for coming. I look across the room and I see familiar faces. Friends are here, and my subject is not a happy subject. It's true, but that's built into it, unfortunately. We're seeing the open release of passionate hatreds, including hatred of Jews. Doug Emhoff, the husband of Vice President Kamala Harris, said as much recently when he convened an emergency meeting at the White House to discuss what he referred to, and these are his words, as an epidemic of hate directed against Jews. 3 weeks prior to that meeting at the White House, Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, testified before the House of Representatives Homeland Security Committee, and he remarked, and I quote him, that Jews in America desperately need support because they're getting hit from all sides. Those are his words, not mine. He noted that some 63% of religious hate crimes in the country were motivated by anti-Semitism. I quote him, "This one's for you, JC." If, as is likely, JC signifies Jesus Christ, burying 2 Jews in snow is but a tiny entry in the vast historical ledger of Christian retribution for the Jews' alleged involvement in the crucifixion of Jesus. As payback, far worse has happened to the Jews over the centuries. But the fact that this incident occurred at all in present-day America and was gleefully showcased on Facebook is telling. What does it tell? Despite our wishes to the contrary, some ancient motives for Jew hatred are by no means past, but remain a threatening presence among us. How large a threat? I'll venture some answers shortly. For now, consider another seemingly minor but no less telling example of contemporary Jew hatred, this one in the form of graffiti. It reads simply but clearly, "The Jews are guilty." Surrounded by crudely drawn swastikas, these words were prominently spray painted on the wall of the Holocaust Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, last May. Similar graffiti appeared time and again on synagogues, Jewish schools, and other Holocaust monuments and memorials. The Jews are guilty is an expression of contempt that originates centuries ago in Christian teachings about Jews as agents of evil. In one form or another, it's alive still today. Versions of it, always accusatory and damning, are part of the contemporary rhetoric of anti-Jewish vilification. The question needs to be asked, of what precisely are the Jews guilty? Answers vary, but to anti-Semites of all kinds, Jews and increasingly the Jewish state are denounced as being eternally at fault for causing whatever is bad, wrong, or evil in the world. To those who think in these terms, the word Jew is a term of abuse. The appellation Zionist functions more and more in a similar way. To our adversaries, Jews and Zionists signify sources of evil, the incarnation of all that is hostile, wicked, even diabolical. just how these notions of ingrained Jewish and Israeli malevolence play out in today's America will be the focus of what I'll be sharing with you. On the most vulgar level, demonization of the Jew is perpetuated through ready-at-hand associations of Jews with Satan or the devil, a connection that originates in New Testament passages about Jews in the synagogue of Satan. If you want to check the sources, take a look at the book of Revelation 2:9 and 3:9. Long ago, this appellation of the Jews as the devil's own people, again a New Testament source in the book of John, evil incarnate, took on a life of its own and became a popular anti-Semitic catchphrase. It circulates widely. A group called the Goyim Defense League, a small but aggressive neo-Nazi hate group active in America, regularly invokes these New Testament references to satanic Jews on large banners they display on the highways of major American cities. You can look it up and see time and again banners quoting these references in the New Testament. The film that basketball star Kyrie Irving recently promoted to his tens of millions of followers on social media explicitly refers to Jews as Satan's children. Louis Farrakhan, the charismatic leader of the Nation of Islam in Chicago, has long denounced Jews as the spawn of the devil in his preachings, and he has a very large and receptive audience. Militant branches of the Black Hebrew Israelite religion routinely do the same, shouting at Jews in the streets of New York and other cities as imposters, not authentic Jews, but the offspring of Satan. Many of those who call on Satan as justification for harming Jews may know nothing whatsoever of the scriptural provenance of such vilification or be regular churchgoers. And yet they've absorbed this widely spread image of devilish Jews, and they sometimes act upon it to assault Jews. On the higher level of religious discourse, hardcore Christian replacement theology posits that God's ancient promises to the Jews were nullified or superseded with the coming of Christ. Jews, of course, refuse to see ourselves in these terms. We would not be Jews at all if we did, and are consequently liable to be scorned as cursed and apostate people, again, phrases from the New Testament, Romans and Galatians. To those who embrace such thinking, God's assignment of the land of Israel to Abraham and his descendants was long ago negated, a religio-political view that encourages aggressive forms of anti-Zionism that demonize the Jewish state as an evil entity and delegitimize the state's right to exist. Let me stress that by no means do all churches in America hold to these views. Some have explicitly forsworn them, but as you'll soon hear, among those that do still remain faithful to these notions, the obsolescence of the Jews is a given, as is the guilt of the Jewish state. More about this in a few moments. The references to diabolical Jews, I realize, sounds archaic, and yet it has a contemporary resonance that needs to be noted by anyone seeking to understand how anti-Jewish and anti-Israel hostility is proliferating in today's America. Consider the following, which may or may not be known to you. In November of 2020, attorney Georgette Kaufman was murdered and her husband was shot and seriously wounded at their home in El Paso, Texas, by someone named Joseph Alvarez, who in his own words, and I quote him, was aiming to execute and exterminate pro-choice Jewish Satan worshippers. Alvarez did not know the Kaufmans, but he was convinced they belonged to what he called, these are his words, the Jewish Satanist Party, and that they were involved in performing abortions by magic in a park near their house. Regarding abortion as a form of what he called Jewish child sacrifice, he felt it his duty to execute people he regarded, again his phrase, as Jewish Satanists. Alvarez is clearly delusional, and yet it would be a mistake to dismiss his case as just another instance of personal derangement, for in its quasi-religious underpinnings, his story resembles numerous others of a similar kind. The following episode is well known to you, so I'll mention it only briefly. But on October 27th, 2018, Robert Bowers, also previously unknown, stormed into Pittsburgh's Tree of Life synagogue and shot 17 people, killing 11 of them. It was the deadliest attack against Jews in American history. An ardent nationalist and white supremacist, Bowers regards Jews as what he called the enemy of white people. Determined to slaughter them, he entered the Pittsburgh synagogue at 10 in the morning on a Shabbat morning, calling out, "All Jews must die," his words, and he gunned down a group of elderly Jewish worshippers. Seized by policemen who had rushed to the scene, Bowers told one of the arresting officers, "I just want to kill Jews." Why, we ask, was he so enraged against Jews? He had numerous reasons, but prominent among them, as he wrote in one of his social media postings, was that Jews are the children of Satan. News of his bloody crime came as a shock to most people, but not to all. Exactly 6 months later to the day, on April 27th, 2019, John Ernest, also previously unknown, followed Robert Bowers' murderous example and entered the Chabad synagogue in Poway, California on the last day of Pesach. Armed with a semi-automatic rifle and shouting, "Jews are ruining the world," he killed one person and wounded 3 others, including the rabbi. After the shooting, he declared, "I feel no remorse. I only wish I had killed more. I'm honored to be the one to send these vile anti-humans into the pit where they shall remain for eternity with Satan." Until he carried out his deadly shooting, Ernest would have seemed an unlikely person to plan such a crime. He was 19 years old at the time. He grew up in a stable family. His father is a science teacher. He had been a nursing student. He claimed to have lots of friends. He played piano for many years, and he regularly attended his parents' Orthodox Presbyterian church. For 18 months prior to the shooting in Poway, however, he had an active life on the internet, and he was an avid poster on 8chan's poll board, a gathering site for white nationalists and neo-Nazis. Just before the Poway shootings, Ernest posted a lengthy open letter or manifesto on that internet site. In it, he presented himself as a martyr prepared to sacrifice himself on behalf of what he called his race and in defense of Christianity. White Christians, he reported, were under attack by Jews, whom he charged with responsibility for the death of Jesus and countless numbers of early Christian saints. Addressing himself to my brothers in Christ, he claimed Jews were inspired by demons and Satan and will attempt to corrupt your soul with sin and perversion. Those are his words. A believing Christian, he assured his readers that they are secure in Christ. He added again his words, one cannot love God without hating Satan. His way of hating Satan was to go after the Jews, the devil's own people. As these and similar sentiments reveal, his thinking combines traditional Christian anti-Semitism and militant white nationalism. This amalgam of two deeply hostile anti-Jewish ideologies is growing on the American far right today, where Nazi insignia at times mingle with large handheld crucifixes in angry street demonstrations. Both were on display at the Capitol insurrection in Washington on January the 6th, 2021, and elsewhere, including at a Holocaust Remembrance Day event in May 2019 in a small Arkansas town, when white supremacist protesters carrying Nazi flags, crosses, and pictures of Jesus had signs saying, the Holocaust never happened, but it should have. And they interrupted that event and kept it from going on. Such activities are fed by several sources, including a small but passionate Christian identity movement that dates to the 19th century and is today undergoing a revival in America on the populist and nativist right, where it combines white aspirations for racial purity with a return of medieval Christian accusations against Jews. Joseph Alvarez, Robert Bowers, and John Earnest are only a few among numerous others motivated by a racially and religiously inspired white supremacist Christian neo-nationalism. It was ostentatiously on display at the large Unite the Right march in Charlottesville, Virginia in August of 2017, where shouts of Jews will not replace us rang out from people wearing Nazi symbols and carrying signs that read, Jews are Satan's children. These people are numerous, they're angry, they're armed, and they're determined to kill Jews. And some of them are doing just that. On December the 10th, 2019, David Anderson and Francine Graham stormed their way, guns blazing, into a kosher supermarket in Jersey City, New Jersey, and killed 4 people. In the assailant's car, police later found a bomb intended to blow up a synagogue in a nearby town. In some of their Facebook postings, they referred to Jews as Nazis and adherents of the synagogue of Satan. That same month, on the 7th night of Hanukkah, Grafton Thomas entered a rabbi's home in Monsey, New York, stabbed and slashed 5 people with a machete. One of them, an elderly rabbi, lay unconscious in the hospital for several months before dying of his wounds. After Mr. Thomas was captured, an investigation of his phone showed he had been searching for what he called Zionist temples within the area. Unable to force his way into the shul adjacent to the rabbi's house, he entered the house itself, a Zionist temple in his view, and went on a stabbing spree. One cannot generalize about the motives of all these people, for they're hardly alike. Bowers and Ernest are radical white supremacists. Anderson and Graham subscribe to an extreme version of the Black Hebrew Israelite movement, a militant religious sect that regards Jews as fakes or imposters and also as adherents of Satan. And Grafton Thomas, who evidently identified as a Muslim, but in his journals also sympathized with the Black Hebrew Israelite denunciation of what he called Jews as devils and as demons. What these people all have in common, though, is clear. They all despise Jews, hold them responsible for most of the world's problems, refer to them as the children of Satan and the incarnation of evil, and have no inhibitions against murdering as many of them as they can. The brutality that I'm sketching in here for you is not, I'm sorry to say, an isolated phenomenon, but part of an upsurge of violence against American Jews and Jewish institutions. What enrages these people and inspires them to assault Jews varies, but always it stems from a passionate conviction that Jews are guilty. And again, we can ask, guilty of what? According to these people, everything that is morally reprehensible, threatening, dangerous, and even diabolical. These notions of an inherent Jewish wickedness are widely disseminated on the internet and on the street, and are now so common as to be almost folkloric. In short, they are part of a popular parlance of Jew hatred that is flourishing in today's America, requires no intellectual or moral justification, and bonds together people who despise and aim to harm Jews. Violent people of the kind I've been describing to you adopt and often act on the hatreds that the culture at large offers to them. And sorry to say, embedded within that culture in today's America are the kinds of accusations against Jews that I've been putting before you. Well beyond the street level, where Jew hatred gets enacted physically, the sources for such antagonism have a well-developed theological basis that dates to the beginnings of Christian anti-Judaism. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, Some churches have recognized the presence of hostile views on Judaism and the Jews within their teaching and preaching and have sought to moderate them. But such sentiments are in fact alive and even resurgent within other churches, including the small Orthodox Presbyterian Church in which John Ernest's family are prominent members. I went on to that church's website to see what's there, and among other things, I find the following, and I quote: "The Orthodox Presbyterian Church uses the Westminster Confession of Faith and Catechisms. In chapter 19, paragraph 3, we confess that the people of Israel, God's people, in the Old Testament, were a church under age. Its ceremonial laws are now abrogated under the New Testament. In other words," and I'm continuing to quote from the website, "in other words, we believe that Old Testament Israel was the church before Christ came. The nation of Israel as it existed as the people of God in the Old Testament is no more." Galatians 6:16 from the New Testament informs us that the church is now the Israel of God. We who trust in Christ are now the nation of Israel. Therefore, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church holds that the political geographical entity known as the modern state of Israel is not significant in and of itself. We pray for the blood descendants of Abraham, the Jews, that they might also believe in Jesus. All of that quoted from the website. Now, it's not possible to conclude that the religious doctrines of this church, which are grounded in supersessionist thinking and replacement theology, directly influenced John Ernest and incited him to want to murder Jews. As already mentioned, other factors were involved. Nevertheless, his church's belief that God's original covenant with Israel has been rendered obsolete and that Christians and the church have replaced Jews and Israel in God's design fundamentally question the ongoing validity of Jewish life and Israel's right to exist. Ernest's church is hardly alone in advancing such a Christian-inspired denigration of the status of Jews and the Jewish state. Consider the following as just a few examples among many that I could put before you. At a major Episcopal Church convention in mid-July 2018, the bishop of the church, Gail Harris, the second leading officer in the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts, testified in support of a resolution that condemned Israel for alleged human rights abuses against Palestinian children. I quote from her testimony at that national convention. This story is about the power of a state over an oppressed people. And while Palestinians may throw rocks, the Israeli government has used consistently weapons that are militaristic and are violent. I was there a couple of years ago on the Temple Mount. A 3-year-old little boy, a Palestinian with his mother, was bouncing a rubber ball. The ball happened to sort of roll away from him and go over the side down to the western wall. and immediately Israeli soldiers came up to the Temple Mount and attempted to put handcuffs on a 3-year-old little boy for doing what? For bouncing a rubber ball. She continues her testimony. I have been there when a teenager, I think he was 15, was walking down the street and encountered a military vehicle belonging to the Israeli government and asked a question. And because that question was not one to the liking of those soldiers, he began to run. They threatened him and they shot him in the back 4 times. He fell on the ground and they shot him again another 6 times. All of this quoted from a bishop of the Episcopal Church at her national convention. What can we learn from this? The charges made in Bishop Harris's testimony were altogether false. Not only were her stories against Israel unsubstantiated and unverifiable, but they were made up. The incidents of Israeli military atrocity that she reported seeing never happened. When challenged to substantiate her claims of having personally witnessed such savage Israeli behavior, and recall that in her testimony she twice proclaimed, I was there, Bishop Harris admitted she in fact saw nothing of the kind, but merely reported what she had heard from others. Who were the others, she was asked? She never identified them. Her supposed eyewitness testimony, in short, was no more than hearsay, had no validity, and was nothing more than an exercise in anti-Israel propaganda, harmfully set forth by a major Episcopal bishop at her church's national convention. The head bishop of the Episcopal diocese persuaded her, when he began hearing complaints, on the need to apologize. She did so, although only a month later, adding that while she could not verify the truth of her testimony, she offered it out of what she called sincere passion for justice for all people. Jews, and in this case the Jewish state, obviously fall outside the circle of her passion for justice. They do so as well among other prominent American church leaders who are similarly given to making passionate accusations against alleged Israeli perfidy. On Martin Luther King Day last year, for instance, J. Herbert Nelson II, the stated clerk of the Presbyterian Church, USA, gave a sermon in which he accused Israel of responsibility for carrying out nothing less than what he called, and I quote him, 21st century slavery. The stated clerk is the highest ranking position in the Presbyterian Church after the moderator or chairman. He's responsible for the office of the General Assembly, which conducts the ecclesiastical work of the church, and he's someone to be listened to. That is particularly so when Dr. Nelson, the first African American selected to the high office he holds, chooses Martin Luther King Day to excoriate Israel for what he called, and I quote him again, its immoral enslavement of Palestinians. Such charges are, of course, outrageous, but the Reverend Nelson went well beyond them in the video he made and posted on his church's website shortly thereafter. The video, entitled "This is Not What God Intended," is devoted entirely to vilifying Israel and its American Jewish supporters. Here are just some lines from that video, and I quote, "We must deal with this issue of Israel-Palestine and do it in a way that's effective. We must begin to look at the Jewish community here in the United States and of Jewish individuals who are supporting these Israeli activities that are going on. And we must hold accountable our government over and over to do what is right." What I witnessed in my visit to Israel was in fact evil. It was evil, and it remains evil. And the Church of Jesus Christ must call it just that. And we must call the current regime in Israel to step down, and we must call our president and our Congress to denounce what is taking place in Palestine, Israel. It is nothing less than 20th century slavery and some of the worst atrocities that the world has ever seen. All of that quoted from this reverend. With his triple repetition of the word evil to describe Israel as a perpetrator of what he calls 20th century slavery and some of the worst atrocities that the world has ever seen, the Reverend Nelson continues the well-established Christian tradition of animosity, which the French Jewish scholar Jules Isaac called the teaching of contempt. This time, though, the contempt is directed not against Judaism and the Jews, but against the Jewish state. The hatred has multiple causes, but a major one for Christian theology in our day is the return of the Jewish people to political sovereignty in its ancient homeland. Condemned to be eternal wanderers for their alleged role in the rejection of Jesus and his crucifixion, Jews were long derided as a homeless people, punished to exist in exile and without a land of their own. That situation changed dramatically in 1948, confounding the notion of Jewish exile and permanent homelessness. Some churches recognize as much and have not only accommodated themselves to Israel's rebirth, but actually celebrated. To others, though, it's problematic. The Presbyterian Church USA is one of those later churches, embracing almost 9,000 congregations in America. It's a divided body, and it does not speak with a single voice about Jews, Judaism, and Israel. The Reverend Nelson's sentiments, however, are representative of a long and adversarial history within the Presbyterian Church of demonizing Israel, and in this instance also attacking American Jews for using what he called their money and power in support of Israel's policies. The charges are scurrilous, but that hardly matters to those within the Presbyterian Church USA, who, in the name of what they call peace and justice, are committed to advancing a theologically driven Christian call to arms against Israel. That call was strongly set forth in January 2014 with the release of the booklet called Zionism Unsettled, produced by the church's Israel-Palestine Mission Network. The authors set out to refute Zionism as what they call a false theology and a heretical doctrine, and they went so far as to claim that Zionism is a pathology, their word, that, quote, promotes death rather than life, and is responsible for what they refer to as ethnic cleansing and cultural genocide. All of that quoted from the booklet. An openly hateful polemic against Israel's legitimacy and right to exist, Zionism Unsettled provoked a heated debate within the church. An activist group called Presbyterians for Middle East Peace sharply criticized the booklet and called for the church to cease distributing it, but in fact, it's still available for purchase on the church's website. There's more I could offer you about this church and other churches. This has already gone on for a bit. Let me, however, conclude by informing you that just recently, the World Council of Churches, a large organization representing an estimated 500 million Christians around the world, appointed a new director, the Reverend Dr. Jerry Pillay from South Africa. He's a Presbyterian minister and an academic dean at a university in Pretoria. Dr. Pillay is on record supporting movements to boycott Israel and comparing what he calls the exclusionary and violent character of the Israeli Zionist project to South Africa's racial apartheid regime. He visited not too long ago a place that he called the Holy Land, and he said he found nothing holy whatsoever during this visit. I'll conclude with these words. I began by referring to the defacement of a Holocaust museum in Florida with swastikas and the words, "The Jews are guilty." The list of sins for which Jews are said to be guilty is long and growing. Also growing are the hostile passions that trigger heated accusations of Jewish malevolence. These passions are today widespread and intense and provoke a growing number of attacks on individual Jews and Jewish institutions. In his early book on anti-Semitism, Jean-Paul Sartre recognized the aims of such hatred. What the anti-Semite wishes for and prepares for, Sartre wrote, is the death of the Jew. And we can add, what the anti-Zionist wishes for and prepares for is the death of the Jewish state. To lend religious sanction to such wishes is obscene. But such obscenities, sometimes on open display, at other times dressed up in the language of religious piety, are now regularly and brutally directed at Jews and at Israel. Thus, the teaching of contempt continues, and the harm it causes likewise continues. It's dangerous, and it must be vigorously and effectively opposed. Thank you. As I said at the beginning, I wish I could bring you good news from America, but on this subject, the news is not very good.
And Alvin, thank you for a very disturbing presentation. I'll make some comments later on about the World Council of Churches.
Yes.
The outgoing Secretary General was just in Israel and met very visibly with President Herzog, and I have some comments to make on that. and my own sort of part of dialogue with the WCC from a different perspective. But let's start with Joel Fishman in the back, and we'll work our way.
Oh my gosh, good to see you again.
Thank you, Alvin. It's a pleasure to see you, and it was a tremendously informative lecture. I would like to share an insight with you. The title of your report, "The Jews Are Guilty," and the fact that this slogan appeared between swastikas
Yes.
is not a coincidence. This slogan comes from the Nazi times. It's die Juden sind schuld. And this was one of Goebbels' favorite refrains.
Yes.
And one of the papers of Jeffrey Herf, he dwelt on it. So
Yes.
when you cite this, you are really going back to one of the major sources of anti-Semitism, effective anti-Semitism in the 20th century. And the purpose of slogans when they were first issued by the political parties was to appeal to masses of people who couldn't understand theological arguments or ideological arguments. It's a way of simplifying things. So it's die Juden sind schuld. That's the message.
Joel, you're right to call attention to that. There were other slogans. When people begin thinking in slogans, they stop thinking. And Hitler knew that. And Germany was plastered with slogans of all kinds. Die Juden sind unser Unglück, for instance, was one. Jude verrecke, another one. I'm sorry to tell you, we're beginning to see slogans in America today. Zionism is racism is a slogan all over the place. Recently, a new one has begun to appear, accompanied by images of three figures on the gallows, and the slogan this time is "The Jews must perish." Jude verrecke, almost literally translated. So we're not in a good time.
Thank you. Rafi? I'll start with people that are fellows at the Jerusalem Center.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Al.
Yes.
It was very instructive.
Professor Rafi Israeli, I don't know if you know each other.
Yes, we do know.
It was very instructive and very horrible to hear, unfortunately. I have two brief questions. One is in the present double context of Hanukkah and the visit of President Zelensky to Washington.
Yes.
We heard President Biden linking between the plight of the Ukrainians today and the victory of the Maccabees during Hanukkah. I think two facts that Zelensky himself, I doubt that he's aware of. Never mind. But do you think that that was a way for President Biden to refer to the wave of anti-Semitism today in America? That's one. And the other was you described the horrible situation of the Jews going back to the 30s and 40s and shaky ground. They don't know where they are.
Right.
Does that move American Jewry to think about defensive or counterattack or moving out or aliyah or something?
Right. Thank you for your question.
Yes, thank you. Because it's
Sure. Sorry.
Very small camera, it's fine.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you for the questions. President Biden more and more is speaking out against anti-Semitism in America, a good and a necessary thing for him to do. And I'm sure also sincere on his part. He's got speechwriters who write his things, but nonetheless, he's beginning to give some voice, prominent voice to this. So that's all to the good. Now, you mentioned the 30s and 40s. I myself am a first-generation American Jew. My parents were born in Tsarist Russia in an area called Podolia, which today is the southwestern Ukraine. And the country that my parents came to in 1924, just before the gates were shut down, in fact, enabled Jews to thrive in many ways. If we got educated, if we applied ourselves, if we succeeded, and so on. Our very success is now being held against us because Americans are beginning to think in very ideological neo-Marxist terms, counting numbers. Jews are somewhere between 2%, 2.4% of the American population. If you were to look at the numbers of Jews in medicine and law and higher education, it would be a good deal higher than that. I've always regarded that as something to be proud of, but it's now being held against us. This expression, the 1%, very, very well, includes a lot of Jews. So it's not a good situation. And changing, I mean, the biggest challenge now is really, in many respects, ideological, and changing people's attitudes towards Jews to have it be less harmful. But I'm seeing quite the opposite. Will it lead to aliyah from America to Israel? Depends what lies ahead. The Jews who tend to come to Israel from America are Dati Jews who come for other reasons as well. My own daughter, however, now lives in Israel. I made a big matuna to Israel. My daughter and 3 of my 5 grandchildren live in Israel. So, there is that. So all these questions you're right to ask them, and we need to keep on top of this stuff. During the 30s and 40s, anti-Semitism was out in the open in America. In the post-war period, especially when more and more people learned about the persecution and mass murder of Jews in Europe, much of that quieted down. Today, we're beginning to see some ugly things reappear.
Joe,
Go ahead. Sorry, others.
given that, first of all, thank you very much for your.
Okay, just ask you, since I don't recognize you, can you?
Okay, my name is Artie Geldman.
Okay, now.
Given that Christian anti-Semitism originated in what later became known as the Catholic Church,
Yes.
Catholic theology, today, would you be able to make any sort of distinction between anti-Semitism coming from the Catholic side of Christianity versus the non-Catholic or Protestant side, seeing that Catholicism is much more centrally controlled,
Right.
and might theoretically have a better chance of dealing with it if it chose to, versus the dispersion of Protestant churches and everyone is independent.
Right.
Just to add to that, I noticed all of your examples, I think, there were no Catholic examples.
Right.
And I'll just add that when I do following the BDS and other Christian frameworks over the last 20 years, with the exception of Pax Christi and 1 or 2 other groups that are active primarily in Europe, the Catholic Church is not involved, as distinct from various part of the Presbyterian
And why?
USA
And
other
if so,
groups. Yeah.
why?
Right. So America is officially, as you know, a secular country. Constitutionally, there's a division between church and state. But socially, politically, is very much so. Compared especially to West European countries, many of which are in what we might call a post-Christian phase, not a post-religious phase because of the Muslim populations there, but in the post. America is in very many respects a Christian country. Now, there are many, many different denominations within American Christianity. Our friends, as it happens, tend to be in the evangelical community, not in the more progressive church communities. Just recently, again, I already spoke for too long, so I left out some things, but a group called the Assemblies of God, the largest evangelical Pentecostal denomination in the world, in November, just last month, issued a very strong statement against anti-Semitism and in support of the Jewish people. I won't read you the report, but it begins this way: within 3 generations of the Holocaust and the genocide that extinguished 6 million Jewish lives, including 1.5 million Jewish children, the scourge of anti-Semitism is again increasing worldwide. The Assemblies of God specifically recognizes the unique history and targeting of Jewish people that have plagued societies and the church for thousands of years. And it goes on in this way, referring to the culmination of what they call theological errors on the part of the church, and they speak out strongly against it. And other churches within the large evangelical community would line up with this. Now, I have to say, also in the same statement, not surprisingly, is the wish that Jews eventually find their way to the ultimate truth and embrace Christ.
Or disappear. That's the other option.
That's part of the package. And I'm sometimes asked by Jewish friends, are you nuts when you're siding with the evangelicals? I said, no, I'm not at all nuts. We're a little people. We need friends. These people are willing to stand with us. And I'm told, yes, but they also want to convert you. And I said, I know they do. What power do they have to convert me? None whatsoever. There's no coercive element in that. So it is what it is. Yeah.
Arthur.
I also want to ask for more. Where is the Catholic Church in this? Have they taken a stand?
Right. So there are some Catholics. One is Father John Pawlikowski of Chicago, who recently came out with a very important statement that's now being discussed by other Catholic theologians. Regarding present-day anti-Semitism, the church's role in past anti-Semitisms. And one big issue before the church, I mean, Christianity is an evangelizing religion, a missionary religion, and to spread the gospel among non-Christians is part of their religious assignment, their religious mission as they see it. Father Pawlikowski was very bold and called for an end to that. That Christians, including, I mean, specifically Catholics, and he's a Catholic priest, have to now revisit the whole question of spreading the gospel among Jews. And when I'm asked about that, as I sometimes am, I say, thank you. You know, I mean, we have our own way of connecting to Hashem, and we don't need intermediaries from others. The Christian way is different. We've got many good friends within the Christian world, and we want to keep those good friends as well. So while I wish these statements, which are very strong and admirable in their outcry against anti-Semitism, did not, I wish it did not include these things. It does. Can I live with it and still sleep at night? Yes, I can.
Thank you very much for a lovely presentation.
Yossi.
A lot of the phenomena that you described have existed for a long time.
Yeah.
But we've seen a very dramatic increase in anti-Semitic incidents over the last few years. Do you have a theory as to why we've seen this sudden dramatic acceleration?
Sure. Now, I also have to acknowledge that what I presented to you today dealt with only a single source,
Sure.
but often an overlooked source, because we all know that on the political right, the political left, et cetera, within parts of the Muslim community, and elsewhere, there's no end of it. It is many, many, many-sided. You heard me speak about just one side today, and often overlooked or neglected side. Can I account for the rise of anti-Semitism?
The recent rise.
Yes. It's been going on since the turn of the millennium. It for sure had to do with 9/11 and the attack, Muslim attack, the jihadist attack on 9/11, 2001. It had to do with the intifadas as well. which put Palestine in the news much more prominently than it had been. In May, recently, the Gaza war in May, when Israel was being hit by rockets, the reaction against Israel, defending itself against rockets, was severe and continuing. So Jews, and particularly Jews here, the Jewish state, has lost favor to a large degree in the so-called progressive communities. I'd say it's, I don't want to say it's yet an altogether lost cause, but there is a progressive reflex now against Israel and the Jews. And social media, there's no doubt about it. We've recently, at my institute, carried out a study of what we can learn by looking at Twitter with respect to Jews, Israel, anti-Semitism. And the incidents just keep going up and up. After Kanye West mouthed off just recently in such outrageous ways, we looked at what Twitter had to say, and he's got a lot of followers, that guy. I've seen something I've never thought about before. I'll try to write something about it. And it's the recreational use of anti-Semitism. When I hear myself even use that phrase, it astonishes me. But there are a lot of people now making fun of anti-Semitism, having pleasure with it. This one stand-up comedian, you've probably heard of Dave Chappelle, who recently came on Saturday Night Live with his own shtick about anti-Semitism, much of it pointing to conspiratorial activity on the parts of Jews who control Hollywood, the media, you name it. And people were in an uproar. They were laughing, they were applauding. It was a performative act of anti-Semitism for, as I now think, recreational pleasure. Whoever would have thought in our lifetime, given all we know about what anti-Semitism at its worst ends up doing, that we would be even thinking in these terms, but it's entertaining.
It was on Saturday Night Live, live from New York, which is, you put the pieces together, and the absurdity is just.
We're dealing with
resonates.
some very tough issues.
Yossi.
Oh, much what I was
Yossi Cooper was.
much what I was going to ask you already referred to, but we always look at it as people who want to promote human rights and things like that.
Yes.
But in fact, what you're saying, this has nothing to do with it. It's,
Right.
it's sheer anti-Semitism,
No
taking
one,
advantage of all kinds of new, very beautiful causes.
no one sitting in this room would be against human rights and social justice, etc. But in the names of human rights and social justice, camouflage terms now for some very bad attitudes and hostile behavior were being hit.
Which means that they have no problem supporting real offenders of human rights, if necessary, in order to.
There are groups for sure working on behalf of human rights who are not anti-Semitic, but as I say, these tend to be camouflage terms, and the people using them are often people of ill will, carrying out malevolent deeds against us.
We continuously make the mistake of referring to these people as human rights organizations.
There are good people behind human
They
rights.
refer to themselves. They refer to themselves.
This is a whole other discussion. You feel? Oh, I'm sorry, Arthur.
No.
Okay, you did okay. You feel? All right. You're telling me we'll do three more questions, and then we'll call it a day. You feel? This is an infinite topic, unfortunately. Alvin, you'll have to come back to
Professor, you mentioned your matana to the state of Israel. So
Yes.
thank you for your matana to the JCPA this morning.
Sure. Thank you.
What I think I'd like to hear, if you can address in a few words, is the role that the PLO-PA Arafat / Abu Mazen has played in exporting this type of anti-Semitism. If we're looking for the possibility of a theory to explain the rise over the past couple of decades,
Yeah.
you mentioned the turn of the century. Turn of the century is Durban, which did an awful lot to be machsher, to
Yes.
put the plumba of kashrut
Yes.
on this rabid kind of anti-Semitism. Annihilationist anti-Semitism, the use of terms of genocide, Jews performing genocide, this annihilationist kind of language is being promoted primarily from Ramallah on a daily basis
Yes.
through many different channels. And
Yes.
I think that has to be addressed as well.
It does have to. Again, in one paper, I can do only so much, and I didn't make mention of it. But sure, they've been working overtime, and I have to say, and I'm sorry to say, effectively. In many circles, they've won this battle. I mentioned before the need to probe hard into the ascendancy of ideology today. One book I would strongly recommend, by the way, if you want to take a look at something, the writer David Bernstein has just published a book called Woke Anti-Semitism. Yes, woke is the name now being used for this very simplistic but effective ideology of explaining human reality in a couple of simple categories. There are the persecutors and the persecuted. There's the oppressed and the oppressors. Israel, within the terms of this ideology, from Ramallah, but not just from all over the place, from Berkeley, California, from NYU, you name it. Israel ends up being the persecutor, the oppressor, and Jews in America who are supportive of Israel are in league with this sinful behavior. Now, none of it will stand up to intellectual scrutiny, but we're not talking, unfortunately, about issues that one can effectively unpack and argue against intellectually. Anti-Semitism is a passion before it becomes an idea or an ideology. It's what people feel. And what they feel these days against Jews and the Jewish state can be ferocious. And you can sit with them, I can sit with them, Gerald can sit with them, put all the data in the world before them to try to reason through to saner arguments. It won't work. So if that won't work, what will work? Every American synagogue, every Jewish school in America, every Jewish community center in America now has security. You can go to church in America, you don't have to pass through the bitachon. There's bitachon everywhere in America. There's one group in America, in New York, has already helped to produce 3,000 security guards to work at American schools, and so on and so forth. There's security in Jewish cemeteries. We're in a new time now, not a good time.
What's the name of the author?
Wait.
Yes,
We're running out of time.
David Bernstein.
David Bernstein.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
I'll just add to go ahead. But Yechiel's question about the PA, just back in the days of Durban and the decade afterwards, there was a Sabeel Ecumenical. I forgot the bishop, the Anglican Bishop of Jerusalem, and one of his Jewish sidekicks did these tours of churches in North America and Europe, in which promoted this ecumenical concept of the Jews, all the supersessionism mixed with the blood libel, all of those things. We documented that back. It's still on the NGO Monitor website.
They've replaced replacement theology with
that was
replacement
all part.
ideology.
That was all part of that. The PA
Israel
encouraged.
with Palestine.
The PA was certainly encouraged and was active in that process.
Religion is an ideology.
One, two, just 1 minute.
Alvin,
Yes, Pedro.
since we're going to have a new government next week,
Oh, you're not going to ask him to do political commentary, too, are you?
can you make any projection?
It's going to make things harder for us. Yes.
Surprise.
Right.
Okay, that's
I'll just sort of
Could you
You know,
comment on
say
the
that-
anti-Semitism of when did Jews become white and their lack of
Right.
qualifying despite being a minority, the diversity, etc.
Right. So after a well-publicized murder of a black, as we know, a couple of years ago, America was challenged and remains challenged by what's been called racial reckoning, a racial reckoning. America, in fact, has a long and shameful history of racism. There's no getting around that. We've made progress in some ways over the years. We need to make more progress. And some of that's been happening. But what set in after the murder of George Floyd was something like moral panic on the part of a great many Americans who were made to feel guilty for the murder, but for also centuries of racism and the like. I think we have to take racism seriously. But as I mentioned, I myself am a first generation American. My parents were not slaveholders or anything like that. They were sitting in Podolia or running away from Podolia. But America right now is in a period of what's called identity politics. And the categories that are stressed are race, class, and gender. And if you're in the right race, class, or gender, you're okay. And otherwise, to quote a famous book, if you're not actively anti-racist, you're a racist. Now, it's nonsense, but that's in fact the slogan. Joel before was talking about slogans. That's a slogan that has caught on, no question. As has the slogan, by the way, Joel, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That's chanted on every campus in America and elsewhere. And again, when one thinks in slogans, one shuts down thought. One is no longer thinking.
On this happy note, I want to thank Alvin for taking the time
Glad.
to present this his own work, his own analysis. It's a continuing process. I urge you to follow Alvin's publications and the lectures of the Institute in Indiana University in Bloomington. It's very easily found on the web, and all the other activities. I still believe, maybe that's part of my DNA, that to be informed, to understand, to do the analysis, do the research, gives you the keys and the tools to be able to find what are the most efficient ways of responding to all these phenomena.
Of course, no.
And your contribution, both as personal research, writing, speaking, but also in terms of bringing this group of scholars together and all feeding each other and working together, is a tremendous. I mean, also with the, I don't want to call it a branch, but the parallel, the close cooperation with David Hirsch's new institute in London, which is a tremendously important development.
Yes.
And there's a new group that's functioning in London in the academic framework, which is stop the monopoly of the anti-Semites in the anti-Semitism studies in the UK, has added greater support and more manpower, more people power towards doing the research and exposing all of this. So all I can say is hopefully next time when you come and visit your grandchildren, you will have somewhat more positive news to give us. But it may get worse before it gets better. As also. So thank you all for coming.
Good to be with you all.
Thank you to